Good morning. My background is engineering. I worked as a component engineer for years, dealing primarily with semiconductor reliability issues. And one thing that I never anticipated was that 35 years in my career, I'd be spending more time dealing with corporate attorneys, contracts law professionals, law enforcement, and people who have nothing to do with any technical engineer, any technical background at all in terms of dealing with an issue. And while I've heard earlier that yes, there's a lot that's known about the counterfeit parts issue, there's still some ways to go. There's still some ways to go with that. And so the main theme here is, yes, this is something everybody's aware of. They can spell it. They generally have some of the fundamentals down, but just being aware is not enough. And the lack of action has unfortunately prompted the government to be pretty heavy-handed in terms of regulatory requirements surrounding it, which is too bad that it took that. But that's the climate that we're dealing with. Earlier points of awareness from 10 years ago now, I'm going back to 2007. Those who weren't neck deep into dealing with this issue, like a few of us were at the time, we'd see in mainstream media, gee, what's all this counterfeit parts stuff going on? I'm not sure I understand what this was about. And eventually got a lot of attention on the Hill. And this is one situation where not aware of many things that have happened where there's been so much attention that's come out of Washington and on the Hill on a specific issue which has to do with the product integrity of defense equipment. In this time frame, and some of you I'm sure have seen this diagram, but what this represents is as we were going through our issues in terms of finding a few counterfeits and trying to understand what was going on, after we had done an extensive stock sweep to purge ourselves of the disease, we did an analysis of the reports of the cases that we found, which were just short of 20 of them that we had gone through, to try and get an understanding of what we're seeing. And what we found was that it was no rhyme or reason into the types of electronic components, whether they were complex or simple. Saw a huge variety of that, significant variety in the types of products in terms of the manufacturers associated with them. But one of the things that we found very quickly was that a lot of this had to do with where you were buying product. You were tending not to see this issue when you're buying product direct from the manufacturer. They're authorized suppliers. However, if you were buying from the open market, chances are if you weren't looking for counterfeits, you were going to get one. And what interesting part of this, which got a lot of attention from government folks when we published this study, were the handoffs here is where, of course we're buying for U.S. suppliers. I mean, we're not going to go buy directly from China. However, we found through due diligence in terms of understanding where they were coming from, we could verify that a significant number of these were coming from Asia. The cases where we don't know is simply because the most removed supplier that we could have our folks get to was not willing to disclose where they got the product. But our intuition and experience tells us that probably most of these came from Asia and were open market products. And what came out of that, which has really kind of become the conventional wisdom today that we all try to work to, is make sure you're careful about where you buy products. Don't get tantalized by open market suppliers. There are cases, particularly in the case of obsolescence, and not being able to design out a product where you're confronted with having to do that. But there's due diligence involved in terms of acquiring those products to get some confidence that they're authentic and reliable, and also report your findings so that others can avoid the potholes that you may hit. So over what is now a 10-year period, in tandem with our study, NavAir, part of the Navy, had initiated a study based on problems they had seen with parts they were getting delivered to the depots. being a problem, had funded the Commerce Department to do an industrial-based study to try and get the arms around just what's the extent of the counterfeiting issue. A lot of surveys went out to contractors, subcontractors, component distributors, component manufacturers, government users. And even though that report didn't come out until 2010, a lot of that data was popping out very quickly and started to really spin up a lot of activity. Then the big wave started, okay? Primarily, if industry had grabbed the bull by the horns and dealt with this issue, there wouldn't have been a Senate Armed Services Committee investigation leading to a painful hearing for those who were invited to testify, and the legislation that came out mandating flow-down of requirements to contractors in terms of how they acquire material, specifically for electronic parts, and the due diligence and reporting expectations associated with that. And though it took a bit, this is relatively fast for regulations to pop out. Yes, typically, very often we've seen that it takes quite a ways before you start seeing specific regulations come out. But starting in 2015 is when the final regulatory case came out in terms of the vetting of the new regulations and a requirement for major contracts to prime manufacturers to implement a counterfeit avoidance and detection system and to flow that down through the supply chain, right down to the component supplier level. And again, so a lot of what folks in this room might be seeing, if they're not defense contractors or subcontractors, they may be seeing some of this stuff, again, because of the mandatory requirements coming out of the Department of Defense at this point, and the desire to reach the lowest level of supply chain, because it's where you buy that material and is where those issues pop up, not at the prime level typically. So as this started unfolding, I mean, there was a lot of discussion again about trusted suppliers, trusted foundry program, which really had its genesis in supporting highly sensitive, highly critical defense applications, buying complex microelectronics from US-based sources with controlled processes. Very quickly realized that, gee, a lot of these types of issues really reach way down into, we're used to using the term COTS associated with assemblies, but contrary to some popular belief, most of the parts that get designed into defense systems are commercial off-the-shelf piece parts. Mil-spec parts are a very small percentage of that. And starting in the 80s, an awful lot of that manufacturing activity for electronic components went offshore. So a big worry about the integrity of the supply chain, and mostly getting worried about insidious threats, the malicious threats, as opposed to greed-based counterfeiting, bad quality parts causing systems to fail, et cetera. Now a lot of worry concerning about infecting systems. So one of the first things we noticed that was coming out of the Pentagon was you had elements of what's called today program protection, which had various forms of this, but had been integrated into a planning activity back in 2011. And you can see that counterfeit parts is just one subset of one element of this big beast here. And it was very clear the Department of Defense was looking at this from a more holistic threat standpoint, not just counterfeit parts, but other malicious threats. Now, more recently, you may have seen in the papers in August was a government-funded report that came out, which was even more broad-brushed, which with respect to the types of threats that the Department of Defense is concerned about, is the technology and also the information associated with it, and having mechanisms put in place to do that. So we certainly expect to see much more pressure put on the defense contractors to deal with this broad base of threats. As I had mentioned earlier, there's now a pretty keen understanding from our customers that, hey, where a lot of this problem lies is deep down in the supply chain. It's not necessarily something that manifests itself at the airplane level. It's the sub-assemblies where parts are purchased and assembled in the boards and then find their way into aircraft and other systems. So there's a major emphasis on how contractors monitor their suppliers and the systems in place to do that. And the regulations that involved are now a part of the government's tool set for evaluating a contractor's procurement system. So if you do not demonstrate a capability with respect to counterfeit parts avoidance and detection and flowing down those requirements, that's a reflection on your entire procurement system, and not getting your procurement system approved is a very big deal. Big R chart from the Defense Contract Management Authority, the Quality Assurance Group. Specifically, they've been tasked with oversight of contractors and evaluating their systems. Just to give you an idea, this is a very complex evaluation process that's involved here. Now, it turns out a few of us in the room here were in a meeting earlier this week with the Chief of Quality Assurance from DCMA, and just kind of giving a state of health. The perspectives are what they've been finding as they look specifically at industry. Direct quote from the head of quality. So this is all basic block and tackle stuff, but we're still seeing that a lot of people aren't doing this. So it's still not setting well in terms of a confidence level with industry on how well folks are really engaging with dealing with the issue. I do understand that it's an issue that manifests itself typically way down the supply chain, 4 or 5 levels. Gee, when we look down in terms of what folks do 4 or 5 levels down, there's a lot of gaps there. So they're really looking at that very seriously. Very concerned about the due diligence done and understanding there are cases when you need to buy from riskier sources. What's the testing that you do in order to mitigate risk? And you'll hear later from Sultan on some of the more current issues associated with that. And government's very concerned that there isn't sufficient due diligence done for open market purchases, particularly with respect to testing. Commingling of supply. If you happen to be commingling parts you buy from authorized sources with parts from open market suppliers, you're going to run into issues there in terms of if you have a problem, how are you going to be able to associate your products that are affected by that? And so there's a lot of scrutiny and critical eyes over dealing with commingling. And beyond just the open market issue, there is also concern about what we contractors do to oversee authorized suppliers, to make sure that those processes are in place and that we're getting the products that we expect to get out of authorized suppliers. Now, talking about an unfortunate experience that we had, which involved authorized suppliers, and why, even though that may be a one-off circumstance, it can be a big deal when it happens. Here's a diagram, very orderly arrangement, description of how material flows through the supply chain from the original manufacturer and through authorized distribution to the people who build products, and also independent distribution sources and potential areas where there may be some penetration. Well, a few of us here, particularly my colleague Scott in the audience here, who's worked with me for years on this issue, we can tell you that the supply chain really kind of looks like this. Folks are familiar with classical literature and maybe Dan Brown movies, right? There's the 9 circles of hell, which have various gradations of sin here. And while counterfeiters actually appear deep down in the circles of hell, be honest with you, everybody in this room fits somewhere here among the circles. okay? It's much more complicated than this orderly depiction. Now, just as an example on just one slice of material flow, talking about from the original manufacturer to authorized distribution, and boy, we love authorized distribution because we, even larger companies in the defense industry, don't buy enough products to get the attention of an Intel or an Analog Devices, for example. So we get product through authorized distribution, key supplies. And also for obsolete products, manufacturer discontinues product. Boy, we love the authorized aftermarket in terms of picking up that supply production and being able to supply product. And eventually product getting to the original manufacturer or contract manufacturer through either authorized distribution or aftermarket. Now, we had one circumstance where there was a counterfeit that we had received from an authorized distributor. And in addition to sorting that particular issue out, it also involved a lot of cleansing and reconciliation through just about everybody here. I mean, you can imagine if you're, say, one of my favorite authorized aftermarket suppliers who, when a original component manufacturer says, okay, you can only sell this product until this time frame or this date code expired product, I want it back, but actually what I want you to do is I'm going to have you offload that to aftermarket. So when this guy finds out, gee, this guy's supply is tainted, boy, does that mess with this relationship, okay? And it turned out that penetration occurred because of a return for convenience from a contract manufacturer. Okay, that's the interesting expression. I never heard that before. Gee, I bought too much. You know, I'm a good customer. Be a good guy and take the stuff back for me if you would. And unfortunately, they sent back stuff that was not from the authorized distributor, and something fell down in that particular process. Now, you got a lot of feedback about how, you know, that never happens. Yeah, it was bad luck, and and really bad luck that happened to sell it to your company, Henry, because we know you guys are pretty serious about this stuff. So I'll just kind of give you an example as to why this is a big deal. What I'm showing you here is a pie chart that represents all the purchases done through the distribution channel for electronic components. Now, this red slice represents independent distribution purchases. It's big and fat so you can see it. If I actually did this to scale, you wouldn't be able to see the line, but I need to illustrate the point. Now, so when we do these purchases, it's very rare, significant vetting, high-level approvals, a lot of due diligence on validating parts. And we know when this is happening, and we do what we can to find out where that product comes. So there's a lot of scrutiny on that. And boy, you know, we love that we're able to do this in the gray area, because we inherently are supposed to be confident in what we get. And our suppliers even tell us, don't touch the stuff, you may damage it, so don't even inspect it. You're going to be better off, okay? Now, within this pie chart is a subset of stuff, which is returns for convenience that the distributor was supposed to have validated, did come from them, and it was still okay, and was returned to stock. Now, as of course we went through our experience, it was, okay, this happened once. Let's look at all the purchases you made, that we made, which were made up of returns for convenience products from other customers. Again, this slice, if that was really to scale, you wouldn't be able to see it. And it's a very small subset within this particular population of stuff. The issue is we don't know when the hell this is happening. We don't get any notification, oh, we're selling you stuff that's returned for convenience, to even know that we could have an opportunity to look at this. So you don't even know this is happening. Now, what we elected to do was forbid the sale of products that were returned from other folks, but that's not a standard practice. So I can tell you from the pain we went through with one particular event, it caused for further changes in scrutiny and flow down to our authorized suppliers, because we got hit by one area where they were vulnerable. Now, how does this all fit into the obsolescence picture? Anybody who does defense work or they've got products where they're supposed to be serviced for many years runs into an issue where the life cycle of the chips that go in are this very thin pipeline, and you're supporting systems that are out there for decades. And with the way the market has shifted from very defense-centric back in the 60s and 70s, the defense market and defense and aerospace in general is so small, it's not even on the radar in terms of a market driver. So the issue here is when you have obsolete products that you have continued demand for, you are inheriting a risk because of counterfeiting issues. And now, particularly with the attention on cyber threats, you're also dealing with that issue where maybe newer systems will come out that'll be more immune. There are systems out there that are vulnerable, and there are vulnerabilities that haven't been exploited yet. So while there's been a lot of work done in terms of due diligence processes for buying from the open market, I'll tell you, my vision of obsolescence management is not look at the bill of material and figure out how many parts we're going to buy from brokers, okay? That's a last resort. And unfortunately, not so much with upper tier suppliers, but with lower tier suppliers, we tend to see that a lot. And the big challenge here is while we certainly have visibility into the product parts that we buy and what's obsolete, it gets to be more and more a challenge with the assemblies that you integrate that are produced by others. And so there's a lot of risk there in terms of dealing with this issue with respect to counterfeit parts and now cybersecurity issues, which we'll see even more attention about over the coming years. So in conclusion, I mean, like we said, a lot of folks are really aware about the counterfeit parts issue, but there's still some way to go in terms of really setting up a robust process to do what you can to avoid putting yourself and your company and your customers in a situation where you're exposed to counterfeit parts risk. So that's my pitch, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Hey.
Great presentation. 2 questions. First, where do you report? You said when you find something, you report it. Is there within the defense part a central place?
Yeah, the resources I'm familiar with is, for example, it wasn't specifically designed for defense use, but it's predominantly used by defense users, is the Government Industry Data Exchange Program. Well, one part of what they do is capture data on failure experience issues, and counterfeiting is a subset. And there's been a lot of work in terms of establishing that reporting of vehicle and improvements coming into play with that. There are some other resources out there. For example, there's ERAI, used to be called Electronic Resellers Association International. They're primarily a dispute resolution business. Gee, I've got one distributor duking it out with another distributor over some quality issue of the product. They can't resolve it, and counterfeits are reported as a part of that activity. That's another very popular one, primarily used by independent distribution, but other contractors do it. But I would say the ERAI database and the Government Industry Data Exchange Program database are the primary areas. Okay. If you look at the data set, I mean, we have to be careful is looking at certain data sets and using that as a means of pointing at trends. I mean, if you were to look at the number of reports that are reported by out of the defense business, you'd think there wasn't a problem out there, okay? The ERAI database is order of magnitude higher, but tends to be, in my view, a little bit weaker on the the technical quality in terms of the assessments done. And if, God forbid, you happen to have acquired a part that's reported and you're trying to figure out what to do about systems, you really need some good solid understanding of the nature of the counterfeit in order to even come close to determining what to do. You stand down the fleet, or do you just handle it as a part of a normal repair process and add that in, or what do you do? So that depends on a data set that tends to be, that is a lot better out of GUIDA. But those are the two primary areas. But please don't use that as a basis of saying, oh, my part hasn't been counterfeited. I can buy that from anywhere and I'll be good. Absolutely not.
So the second question is, it looks like the government is, and I see it too, getting their hands around it with legislation and very prescriptive stuff. Do you see any equivalent in I don't know if you know, but in the industrial commercial space?
Not really. We've seen some starts, okay? Even in the standards arena, it tends to be very light.
Yeah.
We talked about the Society of Automotive Engineers, okay? Well, that was in place before there were planes. It's mostly aerospace folks, and those are mostly aerospace standards we're talking about. Tends to be a lot of government business. You know, it's an industry association, but the government has decided to adopt a lot of industry standards, and a heck of a lot of those are out of the SAE. That's the strongest area, but it's still primarily defense and aerospace, okay? Still see a lot of denial going on too. I mean, anybody see what was the Business Week article that just came out last week that talked about a cybersecurity breach and insertion of a snooping chip in a commercial off-the-shelf server used by a lot of organizations. The immediate statements from the companies that were reported associated with that is, I don't have this problem. This report's wrong. Well, we heard that 10 years ago, right, Scott? Nobody had this problem. You didn't know or didn't want to admit it. So I would say that the commercial industries have really been slow adopters for this kind of stuff. And the folks that have kind of fixed their issues of those who have been brought to their knees, unfortunately, as opposed to taking a clue from other areas.
Thanks.
Very good. Any other questions for Henry? There's a hand over here.
So, Henry, one of the things we see, by the way, great presentation. So one of the things that we see is replacement parts or remanufactured parts. And so it's not a counterfeit. It's openly being sold, and in some cases, even DoD gives a part number for that. Any comments on that?
Yes, what Sultan is referring to is it's a business model that's been around for a while, but it seems to have really reared its head over the last half a decade. Are companies that salvage die, repackage it. And depending on the company and depending on their morals and ethical standing in the world, have varying levels of disclosure about the product and where it came from, and the due diligence done to make sure that the product that they're selling is going to be reliable. And so you see a variety of suppliers that are relatively open about what they do. Gee, I'm taking harvested dye and packaging it up and testing it and putting my part number on it, and this is what I'm willing to offer as a warranty for that product. And fortunately, the buyers have technical people looking at those to see whether or not that's really suitable for their applications. And then you have other companies that do this who I would have to say Scott, I know, has from years ago run into a couple that you ask, one question and they run away, and you can't get them to answer their phones. And in some cases, you say they're not counterfeit. Some of that is kind of open to debate depending on the business model. Okay, it certainly is not reflective of an open market purchase product, for example. Certainly not the original manufacturer's product. So that's an area you need to be careful of. Very popular amongst the folks who are in the sustainment business because, oh geez, the original manufacturer discontinued this product, but I found this other outfit that makes an equivalent product, okay? And so those take some time and effort to go through to understand what those products are and really making an appropriate decision as to whether or not that's really a product you want to get.
Okay,
Not
give
to
it up
say
for
that-
Henry. Oh, I'm
Not
sorry.
to say that the
You're done.
government doesn't do a lot of that. I mean, one of the mitigation strategies for obsolescence years ago, until this issue came up, was, hey, we'll just cannibalize parts right and left, right? Without a lot of strong consideration on potential damage and integrity. But gee, we got to keep the fleet going, so we'll just limp along a little further. So there's some perils with that, and what appears to be a more cost-effective way to deal with a problem may not turn out to be as cost-effective as you think. So that's an area to caution. I'm glad you brought that issue up.
Good. Any others? All righty.